Picture this: a peaceful night on the Pacific Ocean, 1955. The moonlight reflects off the calm waters as a small ship, the MV Joyita, sails through the vastness, heading toward its destination. But something went horribly wrong. When the ship was found, the crew and passengers were gone, vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the eerie silence of the ocean. No sign of a struggle, no distress calls, no explanations. What happened to the MV Joyita, and why did it become one of the most baffling maritime mysteries in history? This is the chilling story of the MV Joyita, a ghost ship that set sail into the unknown, never to return as expected. On October 3, 1955, the MV Joyita, a 68-foot freighter, embarked on a routine voyage from Apia, Samoa, to the Tokelau Islands in the South Pacific. The ship was carrying 25 people, 9 passengers and 16 crew members, including the captain, the first mate, and a handful of sailors. Nothing seemed unusual about this trip. It was supposed to be just another simple journey across the ocean, one of many. But the Joyita would never reach its destination. The vessel had already sailed about 270 miles when something went terribly wrong. As the ship passed through the Pacific, it should have reached its destination in a few days. Instead, after October 3rd, the ship completely disappeared off the radar. Days turned into weeks, and search parties were launched. Yet despite an extensive search, the ship was nowhere to be found. Then, over a month later, on November 10, 1955, a passing ship called the Tuvalu stumbled upon something utterly chilling. There, floating in the open ocean, was the MV Joyita, drifting aimlessly in the water, its hull battered and torn. The ship was a ghost of its former self. But the most chilling detail was that it was empty. There was no sign of the 9 passengers or 16 crew members. Not a single person was found aboard the ship. It was as if they had just vanished without a trace. But it wasn't just the crew and passengers that were missing. When investigators boarded the Joyita, they found strange, unsettling details that raised more questions than answers. The ship's radio was operational, but there was no distress call. The engines were also running, but the ship's steering had been abandoned, leaving it to drift in an unknown direction. The cargo hold was intact, and the ship was floating, seemingly unharmed. Yet, what stood out was the condition of the ship itself. There were signs of damage. The ship's hull had been punctured in multiple areas, and its interior appeared to have been ransacked. Furniture and supplies had been tossed around, but there were no obvious signs of violence or struggle. The captain's personal effects were untouched, and the ship's logbook was missing. However, most bizarre of all was the ship's lifeboats. They were all gone. Where could they have gone? Why were they taken? Were the crew and passengers trying to abandon ship, or had something even stranger taken place? The questions surrounding the MV Joyita's disappearance became even more perplexing. No one could explain why the ship had been abandoned, or what happened to the passengers and crew. Investigators could only offer theories, some plausible, some incredibly far-fetched. One of the first theories suggested that the ship had suffered some kind of mechanical failure, leaving the crew and passengers stranded at sea. However, this theory didn't account for the fact that the ship's engines were running when it was discovered. If they had been stranded, why didn't the crew send out a distress signal? Why didn't they use the radio, which was fully operational? Another theory was that the ship had been attacked by pirates or some kind of criminal group, but this seemed unlikely, as there was no evidence of any violence or struggle on board. The ship's cargo was intact, and no ransom demands were ever made. One of the more intriguing theories pointed to a possible mutiny. Perhaps the crew had staged a rebellion or had some kind of falling out. But again, there was no evidence to support this theory, and no sign of any violence that would indicate a struggle or an uprising. And then, there were the more bizarre and speculative theories. Some suggested that the crew and passengers had been taken by a mysterious force, perhaps something supernatural or extraterrestrial. There were even whispers of UFO sightings in the area around the time of the ship's disappearance. But these ideas, while intriguing, lacked any substantial evidence to back them up. As the investigation continued, theories began to evolve. In 1956, an official inquiry was held to determine what had happened to the Joyita. While the investigation produced some interesting results, it still failed to offer any clear answers. A few facts emerged, though, that raised even more questions. First, it was confirmed that the ship had been in trouble before its disappearance. The Joyita had reportedly been leaking water in the days leading up to its departure. In fact, it had been delayed for repairs due to a leaking hull. Was this the reason the ship had been abandoned? Had the leak worsened, forcing the crew to make a hasty escape? Secondly, it was suggested that the crew may have been injured or incapacitated. But if this were true, why didn't the passengers take over and try to save the ship? Why did they leave everything behind? A theory emerged that the crew had left the ship after it was disabled, taking the lifeboats with them to try to survive. But if they had taken the lifeboats, why didn't they leave any signs of a struggle or distress? Why did they vanish without a trace? As time went on, the theories only became more convoluted. Some investigators argued that the passengers had died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Given the state of the engines, they suggested that the crew and passengers may have been poisoned by exhaust fumes, which could have rendered them unconscious or even caused their deaths. However, there were no signs of poisoning or any remains to support this theory. Others suggested that the ship may have been involved in a freak accident, such as a sudden violent storm or a tidal wave, which could have swept the passengers and crew overboard. But again, no evidence was found to support this theory either. The question remains, if something so dramatic had occurred, why weren't there any signs of it on the ship? Why was the ship still afloat and its engines running? Over the years, the mystery of the MV Joyita has never been solved. No one knows for sure what happened to the crew and passengers, or why the ship was found abandoned. Despite numerous investigations and theories, the case remains one of the greatest maritime mysteries in history. Some believe the ship's eerie fate was simply the result of bad luck, mechanical failure, bad weather, or a freak accident. But others are convinced that something more sinister was at play, perhaps a cover-up, a criminal act, or even something supernatural. The Joyita's ghostly voyage continues to haunt the seas to this day, and as each new generation takes an interest in the mystery, the questions remain unanswered. What really happened to the MV Joyita? Did its crew and passengers disappear of their own accord? Or is there a darker, more twisted story behind this unsolved maritime enigma? Until the truth is revealed, the story of the MV Joyita remains a ghost story of the sea, a tale of a ship that sailed into the night, only to vanish without a trace, leaving behind a legacy of mystery that no one can explain. Thank you for watching, but remember, the truth is always lurking in the shadows. If you're brave enough, subscribe for more true stories, because the next mystery might be closer than you think.